Pleasant day, ma'am. I am Andrea Morina Grilos, and I, together with my partner Windelin Tan, will be reporting Section 4, Confusion or Merger of Rights under Chapter 4, Extinguishment of Obligations. Section 4, or the confusion or merger of rights, is one of the modes of extinguishing an obligation. This section covers 3 articles. These are Article 1275, Article 1276, and Article 1277. As confusion or merger of rights has already been introduced in Article 1231 under Chapter 3, we will be discussing these articles one by one to further understand confusion or merger of rights as a mode of extinguishing an obligation. So let us start with Article 1275.
I am Wendelin Eltan and I am here to discuss the Article 1275. Article 1275, the obligation is extinguished from the time the characters of the creditor and the debtor are merged in the same person. This means that the obligation is void the time the debtor and lender become one with one person. Article 1275 speaks of confusion or merger of rights. So, what is confusion or merger? It is the meeting in the same person of the qualities of the creditor and debtor concerning the same obligation. The characters of the creditor and the obligation are mixed in the same person. Since it is a nonsensical for the said person to push and pursue a claim against his own self, the merger results in the extinguishment of the obligation. These are the reasons or basis for confusion. First, the law treats confusion of merger as a mode of extinguishing obligation because if a debtor is his own creditor, enforcement of the obligation becomes absurd, since a person cannot claim payment from himself. Second is when there is a confusion of rights, the purpose for which the obligation may have been created are deemed realized. So, to explain this briefly, when we say confusion or merger, it means that the qualities or the character of the debtor and the creditor are merged into one in the same person. And so, if that is the case, the obligation is deemed to have been extinguished, meaning to say, the obligation is now merged into the person of the creditor because the creditor now is the new owner of that property. According to the reason or basis for confusion, it would be absurd if you are the owner and you are obliged to deliver the property as payment or mortgage. You are also the creditor, then it would be absurd na you are the debtor and creditor at the same time. So, therefore, in effect, extinguish na dapat yung obligation because you cannot get money from your one side of the pocket and then transfer it to the other side of your pocket. Requisites of confusion. First, the merger of the characters of the creditor and debtor must be in the same person. This means that the character of the debtor and the creditor merge in one person. It's either the principal debtor or merge in the principal creditor. 2. It must take place between the principal debtor and the creditor. The subject of the obligation is between the principal debtor and the principal creditor. Otherwise, confusion or merger will take place between the principal debtor and another creditor, which is not the creditor of the subject of the obligation. Then confusion or merger will not take place because it needed to be the debtor and the creditor of each other in one obligation. If another obligation is being talked about, it's not confusion or merger because, as I have said, you must be each other's debtor and creditor. Lastly, the merger must be complete and definite, meaning to say, if 20,000 pesos yung obligation, the confusion or merger must be equivalent to 20,000 pesos. Otherwise, if it is not complete, therefore, the extinguishment obligation will be partial, meaning to say it is still effective even though the extinguishment is partial, not be extinguished by confusion or merger. Here is an example of confusion or merger. Cleopatra owes Ptolemy 50,000 pesos. Before Ptolemy can collect, he dies, and the credit passes on to his heir, Mark Antony. Sometime in 2018, Mark Antony owed Cleopatra the amount of 50,000 pesos arising from Mark Antony's purchase of a racing horse. In satisfaction with his debt, Mark Antony assigns to Cleopatra the credit he inherited from Ptolemy. So there is now a merger of creditor and debtor in one person.
Next is Article 1276. Article 1276 states that merger which takes place in the person of the principal debtor or creditor benefits the guarantors. Confusion which takes place in the person of any of the latter does not extinguish the obligation. This means that an obligation is extinguished if the merger or confusion takes place in the person of the principal debtor or creditor. However, if the confusion takes place in the person of any of the guarantors, there is no extinguishment of the principal obligation. For example, Anna owes Maria 200,000 pesos and made a negotiable promissory note in favor of Maria. Jane is the guarantor. When we say a guarantor, it is a person who guarantees to pay a borrower's debt if the latter is unable to do so. So the 200,000 pesos is guaranteed by Jane. Maria then assigns the credit to Jake, who later negotiated it to Anna. In this case, the obligation is extinguished as the merger took place in the person of Anna, the principal debtor, who now became the new creditor, and Jane, the guarantor, is also released from her subsidiary obligation and thereby benefiting her. However, if Jake negotiated it to Jane instead of Anna, the principal obligation is not extinguished but only the contract of guarantee, and Anna is therefore liable to pay the amount of 200,000 pesos to Jane, as the latter, who was the guarantor, is now the new creditor. So that is Article 1276. Lastly, we have Article 1277. Article 1277 states that confusion does not extinguish a joint obligation except as regards the share corresponding to the creditor or debtor in whom the two characters concur. This is because in a joint obligation, debts are distinct and separate from each other, and the joint debtors are liable on the debt being considered pro rata or equally. Therefore, if the confusion takes place in one of the joint debtors, the principal obligation is extinguished up to the share which corresponds to him. For example, Jack and Jill jointly owe Finn 300,000 pesos, evidenced by a promissory note. Subsequently, Finn negotiated this promissory note to Jack. The obligation of Jack and Jill is not extinguished as the merger took place only with regard to the obligation of Jack. This is consistent with Article 1277, where confusion does not extinguish a joint obligation except as regards the share corresponding to the creditor or debtor in whom the two characters concur. Therefore, Jack's obligation is extinguished, but Jill's obligation remains. Jill's creditor now will be Jack to the amount of 150,000 pesos. So that was in the case of a joint obligation. However, in a solidary obligation, the entire obligation is extinguished if the confusion takes place in one of the solidary debtors. The remedy of the debtor in whom the confusion took place may still claim a reimbursement from co-debtor for the share which corresponds to them. So that was Section 4, Confusion or Merger of Rights under Extinguishment of Obligations. To sum it all up, Section 4 covers 3 articles. These are Articles 1275, 1276, and 1277. Article 1275 talks about the obligation being extinguished from the time the characters of creditor or debtor are merged in the same person. Article 1276 talks about the effect of merger on guarantors, and lastly, Article 1277, which talks about the merger in joint obligations. That ends our report, ma'am. Thank you and have a great day.